Where did it go?
I answered Greg's questions, and Isabel answered my question.
What about you answer all the questions?
Greg answered your next question.
Okay, so you obviously explained what the extent of the seafloor has been contaminated. And Jeff Chanton mentioned it a little bit, but you had more like a bigger picture, and you said 50, what was the percentage? I'm sorry.
It was about 53%.
53%, but the most was located near the well, and then there was another red area that was further from the well. Is that the same, or do we, basically, is that due to the subsurface plume, or do we know what that's from? Because it's not necessarily connected to the other red area in your map. It was kind of further down southwest.
Yeah, so one thing that Dave mentioned in his talk is that it's not only how much was deposited, but also the material.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, okay, so the question was the map that I show about where hydrocarbons were deposited after Deepwater Horizon spill shows two red spots that are separate. When you compare those patterns of deposition with the drainage at the bottom of the Gulf or the cross-shelf transport, it kind of matches very nice. So it's not only, what we think is not only how much was deposited in one local area, is that it's moving. So that's why not necessarily you see everything connected, is you see like patches of deposition of hydrocarbons in the bottom of the sediments.
Following bathymetry.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then one question I also had as far as oil in the sediments, people have asked the question, how long do they last, or how do they degrade, how fast, how quickly? Can we answer any of there? You guys can give any insight on that?
I think the answer is sure. You can. You lose a lot of that large context of accumulation rate, for example. That is how much accumulates the amount per unit area per unit time gives you an apparent decrease because of the degradation and or the redeposition. So at least by looking at the ICSTOC system, inside the area that is consistent with the timing of the ICSTOC spill shows almost background concentration. So at least at the 30-year boundary, things have degraded to the point that they're close to background. That said, they can still be identified. And those are the interesting aspect about that, and this is where Chris's work is quite critical, and the folks that are doing work in the polar fraction of the petroleum. What we do our work in is principally in the saturated aromatic and biomarker fractions. We don't look at the polar fraction, so we're working with our colleagues up in Calgary and with Chris to sort of try to identify these, I don't want to say never before seen, but not quantified amount of oxygenated hydrocarbons. And so our estimate is that they're not necessarily lost out of the system through degradation, but actually transformed out of the system and incorporated into the polar fraction. And so the jury is out actually about how long they will last because you can't measure them through traditional GCMS techniques doesn't mean that they haven't transformed into a phase that is not amenable to a GC. But if you look at Fourier transform ion cyclotron mass spec, that gives you the kind of oxygenated hydrocarbons and pulls apart the polar fraction, that shows a lot of promise. And so the jury is out. One of the things that we're doing this summer is to go onto the coastal regions in Mexico, into the mangrove swamps, into the lagoonal systems, the back reef systems, to see if indeed what is the chemical composition of this oil. You can actually go to the mangrove swamps, take a core, and you can see it. And I think in the northern Gulf of Mexico, Ed Overton is working in the marsh, and he can almost find fresh oil in many off-axis locations in the north. So I don't want to say the answer is in the context of amenable GC amenable fractions, surely in 30 years you're back down to background signals. But caveat, that may just be the loss of them from the GC amenable into the polar fraction.
Was there a way to tease apart the hydrocarbons? You know, in looking at that last slide of 17 to 30% of the oil ended up on the seabed, is there any way to tease out that the reaction of the Gulf to capture other oil from natural seeps or other oil spills and propagate that out?
Yeah.
Because I know basic math of we took the old and subtracted it from the new, but maybe the conditions of the spill caused more to propagate out than normally would have because of all the extra activity going on due to the Mach flow.
So when you subtract, you get that background out, but it's true that you may have extra material, organic material in there because there are extra other things, so you're draining or cleaning the water column faster. But when we look at the composition of one of these hydrocarbons, they look like oil and similar to Deepwater Horizon, so it definitely showed that there was, relative to the 2010 event, but as you said, it was not a clean picture because as well it has other hydrocarbons that were coming from terrestrial environments and not necessarily directly from the Mississippi at the time, but the water column in the Gulf has a lot of these hydrocarbons that is the background. So if probably there could be a enhance those molecules, even though they were corrected, but also the method of making this calculation has some sort of, I would say, error in the calculation, and that's why we have that range in the amount, because when all these natural or more common occurring hydrocarbons in the water column, they degrade relatively easily. So when we collected or when we accessed the data that was collected in 2011, 2010, there has already been a degradation of those molecules. So it's almost impossible to capture exactly how much got there and how much was only oil separate from the other one because everything was mixed.
Maybe I can make a statement too about this, and it has a lot to do with pinning things on a traditional fingerprinting methodology. You know, the oil industry uses traditional oil, source rock correlations. But if you recall back to the accumulation rate distinctions between the total organic carbon versus the petroleum, in this instance the PAH accumulation rate, one was on the order of micrograms, 10 to the minus 6 grams per centimeter squared per year. The total organic carbon accumulation rate was in grams per centimeter squared per year. So there's an enormous amount of excess carbon which is brought into the system, undoubtedly some hydrocarbons from other sources. I mean, there were 7,000 boats out there chugging away doing their business. But so if one wants to go to court that there's a 99% chance that this is that and the 1% let you off the hook, I don't think it takes into consideration the idea that there's natural aggregation in association with the mechanisms that brought sediment oil down to the bottom. So I think it's a dirty mixture. It will always be a dirty mixture if you put oil in the environment. And so I think that constraint as the range or spatial range that oil actually had an influence on is biased and wrong fundamentally.
Also, it's important to consider that most of the hydrocarbons that were deposited were weathered already. And I didn't mention in detail, when you look at the composition of these compounds, some of them is indicating that it was from the deep plume, and very different from ones that we say that is pyrogenic pHs, which could be from the burning of the oil, could be from the almost 7,000 boats that were around, or it could be for weather Deepwater Horizon, but it was definitely a very strong signal in there. So it's very hard to separate those because it's not like in the surface or in the marshes that you can actually see or smell the oil. This is weather oil, and that's why the cores, even if they have this dark layer, that dark layer is not indicative of the oil. It's indicative of a process that happened after the oil or hydrocarbons were deposited on the surface of the sediments.
I can say one more thing. There was a real subtlety in Isabel's, one of Isabel's slides that showed and I think it has a lot to do with our strategy of isolating the samples at 2-millimeter intervals. And what we were able to show, what Isabel was able to show, is that for cores at 1,000 meters that were at plume depth, you saw areas where there was the intersection, where the plume actually came against the continental slope and deposited a material which is incredibly similar to the plume chemistry. Not the dissolved components, but the droplet components were actually entrained into the continental slope sediments. After that, and this is on the scale of millimeters of deposition, overlaying that plume, you actually have the pyrogenic PAHs. So the plume actually reflects the two mechanisms, the plume depths reflect the two mechanisms of the plume intersecting with the continental slope, and then the marine snow, oiled snow, being deposited on top of it, which is really quite a remarkable aspect that if you were to integrate at 1 centimeter scale, you would lose all of that understanding of the nuance of the sequence, temporal sequence of the process. So I think that was one of the things I think people called us kooky at the beginning because of the, why would you even think to separate this stuff out at 2-millimeter intervals? The background sedimentation rate is 1 millimeter per year. And so it made perfectly good sense to us. And it turned out to be, I think, something that adds a lot of detail in terms of mechanistic aspects of what happens during a large spill that has a significant duration, like the Deepwater Horizon did.
I do have one. Can you guys mentioned Patrick's work quite a bit, but it was not necessarily detailed too much, and you guys kind of background. Can you give a little bit more detail about what he's doing, what he found? Or
sure.
Just like a short version, because I know it has to be.
I'll go for it.
So Patrick Schwinn is another member of their lab who does more on the foram side of things and biology side of things. So I asked him just to kind of give a quick blurb about his work and what he's found in recent studies.
So Patrick Schwinn is working on benthic foraminifera predominantly.
He was the one in the video. You guys seen him in the video at the first one and the second one. He's the one that was moving the mud and anything. But
you got to look at the geology to understand the geology. That's right. The one who said that. Had a nice haircut. No. So he's working on benthic foraminifera, and he's looking at their abundance. He's looking at their community structure, the diversity of them, and he's looking also at the chemistry of them. They are actually short-lived. They last, a couple of weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And they grow consistently, and there's two types. There's epifaunal, which live on the surface, versus infaunal, which actually burrow. A lot of his early work was showing that the epifauna were alive, but the infaunal communities were dying off. Then he saw a really severe drop down in both the epifauna and infaunal species. So their diversity went, they crashed, their abundance crashed, and the community structure crashed. He's also able to look at the chemistry of the shells. So foraminifera precipitate out biogenically calcium carbonate, and they grow these tests that sequentially add on and grow to each other. The calcium carbonate that precipitates incorporates carbon from the dissolved inorganic carbon in which the environment they're growing, as well as a biological food source. So foraminifera aren't so picky, and in other words, they eat what's in front of them. If oil is part of it, it imparts a chemical signature into the carbonate that is being precipitated. Jeff Chanton, who is doing C14 measurements with the program at CImage is showing through the analysis of C14 of the foraminifera that they're actually incorporating dead carbon during these final parts of their lives, and some that continue on show a consistent trend of C14 impacted or C14 dead parts in their carbonate tests. You can also see this in the stable carbon isotope composition of the foram tests. So he's doing a really incredible job of analyzing this really perhaps overlooked species. Maybe people don't see them. They're invertebrates, then they're not large invertebrates, but they make up some of this base of the food web that larger invertebrates eat. But they are essentially recorders of the chemical conditions both at a biological level for sustainability in the benthic system, and they retain a chemical signature even upon death because the foraminiferal tests are preserved in the sediments. Unless the system gets too acidic, that is, unless there's such organic decomposition that the CO2 concentrations from the respired components actually accumulate to lower the pH of pore waters, which is not unheard of, especially with this kind of carbon loading. He's also moving in the direction of plankton foraminifera. So these are animals, these are consumers, they're not primary producers, but they're consumers. And in the Deepwater Horizon event, you saw them increase their accumulation rates in the sediments, which means that they're actually being brought down into the sediments really efficiently. And again, that's the surface-derived components that make up the body of the MOSFA principle.
Yeah, foraminifera, both benthic and planktonic, are also very sensitive environmental indicators. They change very rapidly and adapt to a changing environment. So,
for those of you who are geologists, they're the mainstay of climate reconstructions on timescales of hundreds of thousands of years. So they've been used by paleoceanographers. There are plankton foraminifera that live right at the surface, those that live in intermediate waters, those that live at the thermocline, all the way down into the bottom waters, both as epifauna and infauna. And so they can start to really, their oxygen isotopic composition, carbon isotopic composition, the calcium carbonate components are used really to look at climate and environmental variability on time scales of, sub-annual to hundreds of thousands of years and even millions of years.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Okay, nobody leave yet. We're going to do some wrap-up and some evaluations. Hold on, let me do slides. So first off, thank you. Thank you, speakers.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry.
That's our cue.
So first off, over. For those of you who are online, there will be a link posted in the chat box that you can click on, and it'll take you straight to our evaluation. For those of you here, Larissa's going to be passing around our evaluation. We ask that you complete it to the best of your ability. Let us know what you liked, let us know what you didn't like. Of course, we're here to help you guys and get some information. So any criticism, any good feedback, bad